Good afternoon. So the last 15 months of my 20-year career, I spent enrolled in a VA polytrauma unit to treat my PTSD, traumatic brain injury, and some musculoskeletal injuries. And some of you are probably wondering if I'm going to get mad or cuss. I'm doing this without notes. How's this going to work out? And frankly, I don't know either. Let's start with a far more likely possibility, and that is that the people in this room, you Homeland Security professionals, you first responders, emergency management specialists, will lower the incidence and prevalence of suicide in the first responder community and the populations that you serve by extension, along with the veteran community. That's going to take a journey in a new direction, and I'm going to share with you a little bit of my own journey, which I hope will impart some language that you can speak into that terrain and a lens through which you can use to illuminate some of your steps. So I hope that in the next few minutes you'll learn those things and consider me your guide for the most part. So part of my story starts here, and I took this picture in southern Afghanistan, not far from where in ancient times Silk Road passed and cultures from across the continent would trade artifacts, ethnic goods, and even warfare. What you don't see in this picture is I'm standing waist deep in a blast crater created by an IED that's meant to kill me and the gentleman in that picture. My job in Afghanistan was counter IED, defeat the device in the field, attack the network that put it there, and train our troops and our allies not to get killed by these things. So the analogy I make in this is that human life is a currency of warfare. It's the ultimate denomination. So consider that the balance or the principle of how we obtain our national security objectives. What we don't often talk about is the black market economy or the unreported economy, where we trade something I think is valuable is our human lives, and that's our character, our identity, and our sense of humanity and morality. So I'm standing in this crater and I'm collecting blast evidence with this economy at my feet. And after a while, I was slowly planting the seeds that would become the indicators or symptoms which I would present about 5 years after coming home into a post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis. And to say that I came back with some scar tissue that you can't see is a bit of an understatement. And even though I went through the gold standard therapy of what the VA and other civilian providers could provide, I conscientiously pursued my therapy objectives, did my homework, attended all my sessions, did all of that. I took my meds like a good little student, and I still felt this unresolved guilt, loss, and shame. And so I went to my higher power and got no relief either. So I came to the conclusion, clearly it was my responsibility because I wasn't healing, that I did not deserve to heal, to take my own life. Sadly, for the beneficiaries of my life insurance policy, I failed. Another one of my life failures. In essence, I was treated for something that I didn't necessarily have in full, and I was given the wrong diagnosis, given the wrong treatment, and administered by the people, or administered through the hands of the wrong people. I was treated for post-traumatic stress disorder when in fact I was in need of moral injury care. So what is moral injury? I can tell you what it's not. It's not post-traumatic stress. This is my analogy, and like any other metaphor, it breaks down if you take it too far, so stay with me on the surface here. The beast on the left is a wolf, that's what I call moral injury. The animal on the right is the dog that we have subordinated to symptom reduction, which is post-traumatic stress. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment, but in essence, we fail to understand the disparities and the similarities of these two afflictions. And so we're treating both, if we recognize both, according to the medical one, which is post-traumatic stress disorder. The footprints on the left are single track. Those are actually wolf footprints where their hips are set physically. They track in a single line. The dog are side by side. Keep this in mind. It'll be important later on. But failing to recognize the footprints of these things leads to social isolation, addiction, suicidal behaviors. Why do I mention social isolation? It's one of the American Academy of Social Work's grand challenges to eradicate it. It's as unhealthy for you to be socially isolated as it is to smoke. Two big numbers that determine your wellness are your zip code and the number of social connections that you have. The outlying attributes of moral injury are guilt, loss, and shame. and these are the killers. These are what will put an individual on his or her island. So let's get into some terms, and this is the language that might be useful on your journey. Post-traumatic stress, by definition, and from a grunt's view, is from an experience. Dude, we almost died. This is my buddy Alex in Iraq. This is one of the IED attacks he survived, a complex attack, disabled the lead vehicle. You can see the motor oil sprayed over the top of the hood there. Pretty well-placed sniper shot at the driver as well as the gunner. They survived that. And this results in essentially what the Diagnostic Statistics Manual describes in symptom clusters as avoidance, intrusiveness, intrusive thoughts or re-experiencing the event, avoidance, hypervigilance, altered cognition and mood. Trauma, in essence, rewires the brain, and it is doing for the species what is actually harmful to the individual. It is there to serve a purpose. It changes the way you do emotional business with the world. It changes your biology, and it changes your mental capacity as well, as does moral injury. So I'm going to give you a few pillars that constitute the broader scope of what moral injury is, and the first is moral perfectionism, and that is zero defects. So we train our young Marines, airmen, soldiers, sailors, that if you do all the right things perfectly, you'll get a good outcome 100% of the time. And we all know that that's not true. This young medic, she's working furiously in the back of a helicopter doing the job of a trauma team in our most modern ERs, in the back of a helicopter wearing a night optics device that's doing evasive maneuvers while they're getting shot at on a soldier who she knows she's not going to save. This young man didn't make it, and you would obviously don't think that she's going to step off that helicopter having failed at her job to save him and brush it off and say, well, I did everything I could, I did everything right, let's go hit the chow hall. Moral uncertainty, doing what you think is right, not knowing if it is, and never knowing. So my unit, we would live out in the mud culottes amongst the locals for weeks at a time, and we'd essentially chase out the foreign fighters and the Taliban, and whoever was left behind oftentimes were the foreign fighters' families, Taliban families, and many of them locals intermixed. Doesn't matter to us, we treat them the same. One of our medics here is treating a young lady with a pretty bad skin infection for several days at a time. But we eventually have to leave. And days after that we leave, the foreign fighters and the Taliban come back in, and our drone operators are watching the pattern of life in these same areas, and they watch people like this get summarily executed and tortured because they cooperated with Americans. There's a sense of helplessness on a lot of people's part, that you just don't have the capacity to do well in a situation that has no good outcomes. As emergency management specialist, I am sure that many of you have exercised moral uncertainty all the time. Where to put assets, where to mitigate risk, how to distribute resources. And next is moral luck. And that is that none of us operate with perfect information 100% of the time in a timely manner. This is a daytime shot looking across the wadi about 1,200 meters from an overwatch where we had the night before. We had small units flanking either side of this tree line, and our gunner looking through this very sophisticated targeting device, has it on thermal, and sees some personnel working up some heavy weaponry. So they begin to work up what they call a firing solution, which is a big term for we're aiming at you with a big gun. And just a few moments before they cut loose with this 20 millimeter cannon, the youngest and lowest ranking member of our platoon asked, did we ask our frontline units for a trace? And all that means is for everyone to turn on their laser designators on their individual weapons and wave them on the ground so we can see you. Well, sure enough, we were aiming at our own guys. We got really lucky. Napoleon calls warfare a series of mistakes. In few other professions, as in Homeland Security and in warfare, is the line between competency and morality so thin. And then the big one is moral injury. And by definition, the scholars and the thought leaders in this field could pretty much converge on the definition that it is the act or the omission of an act which violates one's deeply held personal, spiritual, or moral beliefs. This is the unreported economy right here. This is the interest that are military personnel that our first responders take after they do everything right. So these are the terms, and you now have a lens, and so you remember the tracks, right? Nice clean footprints, single line, moral injury, double track, trauma. You step out in the landscape and this is what you see. So how'd we get here? Around 2006, for a number of reasons, the Vietnam veteran population start to come in and get service for their mental health through the VA. Operation Iraqi Freedom and Enduring Freedom veterans from Afghanistan start to come back much faster. And so there's this bow wave of demand for mental health services. The VA, in response to this, disseminates 2 manualized treatments by 2015 called cognitive processing therapy and prolonged exposure therapy, along with benzodiazepines and other medications to reduce anxiety and increase the individual's ability to sleep. So by 2015, they had trained about 6,800 therapists and providers across the nation to give these. This is their fastest, most reactive way to treat this mental illness. Problem is that these therapies are developed for sexual assault survivors in single incidents. So you have one population, sexual assault survivor, who never volunteered themselves into this position and probably never ever go back, and someone who raised their hand to volunteer themselves into a position, and most of the time would go back, even knowing that they're going to get this affliction. So my point is the origin of injury matters. So you have a divergence then in this population. It's not like a broken arm through a Western medical lens where I say, I don't care how you broke it, if you fell off a ladder or you were skateboarding or whatever, I'm going to set it and treat it the same. We can't do that with military personnel and our first responders like we can with a sexual assault survivor. I'm not here to bash the VA at all. The VA is full of really talented, hardworking, good people doing incredibly difficult work in a challenging bureaucracy. I am saying that we need to close a gap between what we know about moral injury and where those treatments exist and lie, and how we go about treating post-traumatic stress. I'm not saying to throw away the interventions for trauma in this population at all. I'm saying that we have to have some very elegant thinking about what those disparities are and where the intervention should lie. So, is this a Homeland Security issue? Without vomiting too many statistics on you, in 2018, for the 3rd year in a row, more law enforcement officers took their own lives and died in the line of duty. It's a retention issue. It's a morale issue. That's just in one discipline in this broader endeavor that we call Homeland Security. The nation cannot afford to have its veterans take their own lives at 20 to 22 people a day. The nation cannot afford to lose its law enforcement officers. The nation cannot afford to lose its paramedics, its healthcare professionals, its trauma surgeons, its nurses, through institutional betrayal, or to suffer from these afflictions. I want you as my neighbor. I want you coaching my kids. I want to sit next to you in church. I want you as my teachers. You have a wealth of knowledge about humanity, just like our veterans do. And we need that post your service, and we can't get there, again, if we have the wrong diagnosis with the wrong treatment in the hands of the wrong people. So, moral injury, there's a low awareness for it, for one. The second is the research and the inquiry on it hasn't translated into interventions and programs that are widely disseminated. They're out there, they're very effective. And to my count, in my brief survey, there's basically 5 formal ones with 43 therapists in the United States administer them. We don't screen for it like we screen for trauma, and we don't have the evaluation measures that we use to evaluate programs for moral injury. So, in essence, moral injury is where trauma was 40 years ago. So think about that for a second. Think about if I asked you to tackle your problems in your agency with the complex environment that you operate in, with tools, mindset, mentality, and programs, and even a budget from 40 years ago. That's what we're expecting our mental health providers to do right now. So I invite you to take this journey, use the language, look through this lens, reevaluate what happens in your own personnel, in your own agency. Stay in contact with each other. Godspeed. Thank you. Please don't refer your people and write it off just like you're writing a referral to someone. Don't, if you have an inkling that you have a subordinate or someone that you're mentoring has an issue, do not give them an 800 number. Do not hand them a pamphlet. Don't refer them to, don't just say, walk down the hall and see the social worker or the counselor. Please don't. It's as good as me saying, oh, you have a crisis here, read the Bible. Be Velcro. Stick with that person until they open up and talk. Like the talk earlier about eliciting information from someone. If they are giving you invitation to come alongside them, come alongside them. There's nothing more important that needs to be done. Not your next meeting, not your next briefing. Delegate that. They came to you. Because when you write them off, that's another form of institutional betrayal, in essence. And we send mixed messages when it comes to mental health. Even the definition of post-traumatic stress disorder in the DSM-5 is conflicting. Because it says, well, you're normal because this is a perfectly normal reaction to an abnormal incident. Stop saying that. Stop. If it wasn't normal, none of you would have a job, right? Warfare, disaster, violence, it's normal. So it says you're normal, but you're mentally disordered. It doesn't make sense. So they're looking for a connection, and what the failure of psychology has been, in the words of Dr. Lisa Finlay, is that we have pathologized shame and guilt. We've made it maladaptive rather than valuable, intrapsychic rather than relational. When some forms of it actually lend to pro-social behavior, perspective taking, and empathy. And so what mental health does with these two interventions is it takes what is essentially a moral quandary and it answers it in a completely different language. Think your way out of it. They actually have a tool, it's called a guilt wheel. Like, let's just talk about how much responsibility you had for so-and-so's death or their injury. Really? Like, you're gonna give me a pie chart and I'm gonna rank, well, my commander made this bad decision and weather we played this part and the equipment this part, and so I guess I own about 7%. Stick with them. I love Wood's book. For those of you who don't know, he wrote a book called What Have We Done? And I appreciate it because it doesn't give you this nice, clean answer, just like psychology wants to, or some of these other interventions. It's an invitation to inquiry. Honestly, in any other, when you do your literature reviews, you look at the body of literature, the thought leaders in this pretty much, surface around 2009. There's, of course, inquiry and research and writing well before that, but Drs. Nash, Dr. Litz, Dr. Tick, Dr. Rita Brock, all, are major players in this thought space, and Woods brings them to bear on this subject. I think it's great because anything that primes the discussion, just like this program, that invites more inquiry and thinking on it, elevates it. Because we don't have the moral discourse that we do. We're not as fluent or eloquent as we are in operational terms and strategy and those types of things when it comes to war making. But we fail to recognize what it is that our military force comes back with, and we say, well, what good have these wars been? If we're take to anything from them, if you ask me, my generation of veterans, I'd only be known for PTSD and suicide. My generation, just like World War I, World War II, they put us on economic footing to become a superpower. Vietnam generation, Korean War vets came back and they became activists, and they are largely responsible for the incredible amount of benefits that I am so grateful for that saved my life. What is my post-war legacy going to be? And I think Woods, primes that discussion, and I want my post-war legacy to be that we are giving voice, we are giving a moral discourse and narrative and informing the discussion of what it means to trade in this economy of human life. Because we can't always just go to the hammer, right? Like, we are full of brilliant people in smart ways, and we don't talk about that interest that never gets paid down, and who's bearing that right now? Your Marine is. People that Dave Brandon has served with, people that I've served with. We owe it to our nation, right? Let me give you some background on screening measures and diagnostics tools. If you've ever been to a provider and they give you that little check, there's one of several checklists that says, I have little or no interest in doing things. I've moved so slowly that other people notice. I feel hopeless, those types of things. Those are screenings for things like depression, anxiety, trauma. And we don't have disseminated screening tools, diagnostic measures for moral injury. Again, it's not a medical condition. By Dr. Rita Brock's definition and TIC, it's a soul wound. So there are a couple out there. One of them is Dr. William Nash. It's a moral injury event scale. It's he admits it's even limited, and there's one other out there, but Nash's MISE is one. And if you go to Syracuse University, they have a moral injury project, which has a repository of literature on it as well. And I'm glad you asked about referred to the stigma, like man up, we can't talk about it. Noel's going to give you his opinion right now. So it just doesn't make sense to me for cops and firefighters and medics and military personnel who go through years of training, spend decades in a profession, going through all the frontline stuff, and then all of a sudden you're going to tell me that they are suffering from an affliction rooted in fear. It makes far more sense to me if you were to say their moral architecture came in contact with the exigencies of their job. It makes them human. And so the stigma to me is aggravating, because if it's so normal, then why, and we know that it's coming. We're always going to go to war. We're always going to lose people in emergencies. Bad things are going to happen, and we're going to have these reactions. So why is there stigma at all about it? I'm not sure. I believe education on the front end is extremely important. Things like case studies, you can generate them on your own, and go through your department and look at call-outs you guys have been on, do some role-playing, talk in a round table, what would I do, how might I react? And there's you're always gonna have your men and women in some kind of moral quandary. And I think if on the front end, if people realize that and they're a little more equipped and there's some structure behind it and language to it, that it normalizes it. Because when we don't talk about it at all, and there's not terminology for it, and if we do talk about it, it's always in terms of post-traumatic stress, you're disordered, right? It's at best useless and at worst harmful. So, if you can introduce some of these terms and get educated on it, create the case studies, become familiar with some of the frameworks. And I think if people are apprised of it, it's not going to prevent it, obviously, but it's going to give them some tools to be able to cope with it and normalize it, because no one in your stations, in your house, are going to be exempt from it, right? And if I may also offer, resiliency is a nuanced word. Just be careful with it with your folks, because you run into the danger of saying that it's a attribute, positive attribute, personal characteristic, And if you don't have it, if you're not resilient, then you're faulty. It's a question of leadership, and it is love. If you are not loving people, you are not leading them, and love sacrificially to the point where they know that you're going to go to ends of the earth just like you would on a call out, but from whatever position that is. And like I said, I get it. You always have competing, demands and resources and things like that. But if you exercise, and use the E word, some empathy, and you are that individual, you're that young firefighter, and your supervisor, she's visiting your firehouse, coming to you at your station, checking in on you, almost badgering you, in a genuine and authentic way, that goes to me a lot farther than saying, well, we got you the best social worker or the best counselor, got you some days off, that type of thing. And I would also submit that individuals, peers coming alongside each other, you don't have to be perfect and healed by any measure to be effective for each other. It helps them make sense and meaning of their own struggle. If they are properly equipped, it can be dangerous too.